Welcome to Democracy Nerd. A recent interview with New York Times executive editor Joe Kahn has caused a little bit of controversy. Kahn told Ben Smith, formerly of Politico and BuzzFeed, that threats to democracy are not a priority for the Times. And I'm quoting here, "It's New York Times' job to cover the full range of issues that people have," Kahn told Smith. "Democracy is one of them, but it's not the top one." We ask, well, what could be more important? Should it be one of many or one of the really important of several? The 1969 book, The Selling of the President, 1968, explained the marketing campaign to sell Richard Nixon to the American voters. Another book for aspiring nerds is The Nightly News Nightmare, about cable news's impact on press coverage of presidential elections. The 24-hour news cycle pushes horse race coverage, trading substance for sound bites. Marketing of candidates plus horse race coverage has been sort of the template of the past 40 years of presidential election coverage. But should it? When one of the candidates, arguably, or maybe not arguably, poses a threat to democracy. Andrea Grimes, our guest today, doesn't think so. She's been critical of what she calls the media's wash and rinse take towards presidential elections. So to discuss the success and failure of the American media in this election, we welcome Andrea Grimes, independent journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Texas Observer, Dame Magazine, and elsewhere. Andrea, thank you so much. We're honored to have you, and welcome to Democracy Nerd.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. Appreciate it.
So, what was your initial response with the New York Times executive editor in that comment that I mentioned, Joe Kahn with Ben Smith, when someone would argue that it was not as critical a focus? Did it jump out at you? Did you have a response to it?
My response was duh, basically. I mean, it's very clear, I think, based on the Times's ongoing coverage of Trump really since 2015, since he became a serious candidate and then the president, that the Times and the Beltway press and mainstream political press has treated Trump as though he is a normal candidate, right? And not the threat to democracy that he is. So when Kahn said, we can't treat this guy any differently. We're not focused on this particular threat to democracy. Naming it as a threat to democracy would be a bridge too far. It was, I was surprised that he admitted it. But I was not surprised in the substance of what he said.
What would a New York Times, if you were editor of the New York Times, and that doesn't mean just if you were you, right? And or if I were me, right? But if you were editor of the New York Times, meaning you could like, or a New York Times editor you could imagine, how would you advise them to approach it? How would that manifest itself? What would it read like? What would it sound like? What the headlines look like? And how would it be different than another presidential election?
Sure. I think basic language is really one of the top issues, and has been an issue for years with regard to Trump and the Republican Party, and the insurrection and all of this stuff, right? Just naming things for what they are, using words like lies, lying, and instead of mislead, falsifying, right? That sort of stuff. Naming fascist policies and using the term fascism to describe fascist beliefs and behaviors, right? Focusing on demonstrable threats to democracy, to enfranchisement, to voting rights, to civil rights, making those really the front page headlines rather than the horse race or sort of the intrigue or the sort of splashy sort of backroom White House stuff, and really focusing on impact on real people, and real voters and Americans and citizens and undocumented folks, right? I think you'd see, I think that there's just a lot more space to grow into actual reporting on reality rather than reporting by a pundit class for a pundit class.
Where do you think they particularly get it wrong? And it might just be the inverse of the things that you just said. But what are particular examples, if they're at the ready, or even just sort of thematic mistakes that you think they make?
Sure. I mean, the the Hillary Clinton emails is the classic example,
Yeah.
right? Of pretending as though there was some equivalent between Hillary Clinton's data privacy and anything Donald Trump could do or has ever done, right? I think that we're seeing a lot of um Trump shows his hand all the time. I mean, he's incapable of stringing coherent words together, but what he does manage to get out is pretty terrifying, right? Um, and that I feel is too often treated as like business as usual, as normal, as though, he might be speaking as coherently as anyone else, right? Rather than treating his incoherence as itself a fundamental problem, as a story, as a disqualifying characteristic of a president or a presidential candidate, right? I think at this point, that's one of the things that I would really focus on if I were um, covering the White House, the race for the White House, that sort of thing, is focusing on how fundamentally unqualified, unready the guy is, right? As itself a threat to democracy. On top of everything else, the fact that he's a grifter and a sexual abuser and all of those sorts of things, right? The increased normalization as though there is always a balance between something Trump is doing and something Biden is doing, right? Or something the Republicans are doing and something the Democrats are doing. It's just not the case. We're not dealing with two equally batty both sides here. We're dealing with fascists and I don't know, something else.
We got a fundamental media problem, and even I fall into the trap because we live our lives and we're prisoners of every moment. And the thing that used to drive me nuts is I would listen to, it's a different problem, to be clear, overlapping problem, I would say, but it's certainly a different institution. And so I stick to the New York Times, or at least tag the New York Times again. WMIC just had a feature raising the question: is the New York Times a tech company now? And if you view the New York Times as a capitalist institution, that's its primary purpose, is to give value to its owners. And if it's surviving and thriving in a new media age because it's merging strategies with tech companies, kind of becoming one. I mean, Wirecutter, which I used very often to pick what kind of household appliance I'm going to get, right? By the way, Consumer Reports usually gives better reviews, but when I use Wirecutter, and that's an online company that they bought, and now it's part of the New York Times. New York Times gave it its brand, but then they're using an algorithm and some reviews to market to me, and then they're getting revenue from that. It's a different thing than reporting the news, and then it's not necessarily too dissimilar from the Les Moonves line, right? Donald Trump is bad for the country, but might be bad for the country, but he's good for CBS. Uh, where it's like, yeah, he's good copy. We've got a fundamental media problem, and I want to just ask you questions, but I've got to make sure I don't fall in the same trap. Yeah, this is different. We've got a fundamental media problem, and when we see the problem with, well, let me turn it into a question because it's supposed to be an interview. Uh, what are examples, rather than saying mine, what are examples you see of where the media problem we have is being reflected by viewpoints that we're then seeing in the polls? The one that was coming to my mind, so I don't just hide the ball, is where people are saying we're in a recession, saying
Mhm.
that we've had record unemployment, and we've had record low, at least a record low streak of low unemployment, where
Mhm.
people think that inflation is getting worse when it's just kind of not great, when people think that we have higher joblessness when joblessness is improved. And obviously, that's a significant part of that is because what media they're watching and not watching. And we know that a significant majority of YouTube watchers are people who say they get their news from YouTube, say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. Those who watch other media say they're not going to vote for Donald Trump. What sticks out at you as manifestations, as proof positive the media is getting it wrong?
I mean, really, I don't know how much time you have for a rant about broadcast news, but I could go basically for about
Granted,
36 hours straight on it. But I almost never consume traditional broadcast news, even cable broadcast news, unless I'm in a waiting room, right, at the airport, that sort of thing, or when I'm spending
Unless you're
time
in a
with
painful
my
circumstance.
indeed, or in less painful, but sometimes painful circumstances when I'm at home with my family who live in suburban North Texas. My parents who are Republicans and very avid television news
Mhm.
watchers. And that includes just like their local, 10 p.m. news, but also there's sort of the specter of Tucker looms in the background of my dad's, study all the time, right? And the the world of the TV news, truly I feel like a tinfoil hat person saying this. Like the world of the TV news boggles me because I read, a lot of news. I read the Times and the Post and the LA Times, and I read my local, Austin American Statesman here, and I read a lot of progressive news. It's my job to consume and share news as a commentator, as a pundit. And the world that is reflected in my parents' television when I am there watching with them and the world I see with my own eyes in front of me every day are two entirely different places. They are different universes, right? On the TV news, it's crime, it's inflation, it's Biden is too old, it's Biden has lost his mind. It's like the it's not just like a poor distillation of reality, it's a reality I don't recognize, right? Because in my reality, a lot of other things are happening, right? There are abortion bans and a former president on trial and, a genocide going on in Gaza, right? And the overlap between the world I feel I live in and the world I see on the television news is so thin. And I don't it truly, like, I don't know how to reconcile those two universes. And it shocks and surprises and dismays me that more broadcast journalists and media makers don't see a disconnect, don't recognize a disconnect, or if they do, don't seek to correct for it. It truly, like, I don't,
Why
it's,
don't you think? Why don't think you see? Why do you think that they don't see? To use your word, a disconnect.
I mean, some of it I would imagine depends on the form itself, right? I mean, especially if you're talking about producing a nightly news broadcast at 10 p.m. every night and you're a reporter out on the whatever beat, right? You're just focused on getting your, stand up in and getting your clips done and getting your B-roll and turning that in. I think you get caught in this churn where you don't necessarily see the whole picture, right? So I don't particularly put the blame on individual news reporters or creators, but I think when you start moving up the chain to newsroom producers and editors, I think that's also where you see complacency. I think where you see profit motivation over other motivations that to me feel truer for journalism, right? Um, and I don't genuinely think, like, the question that sort of underlies what you're asking here is, was it ever not thus? Has journalism ever been a pure, honest pursuit of truth and righteousness? Arguably not. Journalism has been motivated by profit for most of the institution's life as we know it, right? When we think of sort of like golden ages of journalism or even new journalism in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Even then, we were journalism was even more dominated by white guys, right? So the perspectives were highly limited. There was still a lot of, biased coverage and both sidesing, right? It's just that as I think America plods ever closer to collapse, it becomes harder and harder to excuse and reconcile, what we're seeing on the television with what we experience in our real lives. Which is, I think, to get back to your question on, how could we believe that inflation is so terrible and unemployment is so bad when demonstrably it's not, right? Um, I think because there is actually like a vibes disconnect in the way people feel about their daily lives and the like low level terror threat of the country feeling fundamentally unstable, right? Because there is this Republican presidential candidate who threatens democracy as we know it. Um, and I think people don't really know how to grapple with the fact that like inflation could be fine and jobs could be pretty good while this monster is looming on the horizon too, right? And I think all of that is very poorly explained and packaged in general by most newsmakers. You really have to cobble together your news these days, right? Which I think is a lost skill if we ever had it. So yeah. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
But no, I appreciate it. It also gave me a chance to consider a little bit. Can a commercial model of
Mhm.
journalism be successful if it takes as its primary mission and approach to defend or even improve democracy and hold capital to account? Can, in fact, a commercial model be successful if its mission or primary approach is to defend or even improve democracy and hold capital to account?
I think it depends on your metric for success. I
Can it be financially viable? And
financially
no,
viable.
I'll take the bait on that quickly. To be financially viable
Okay.
and have lots of and become important, like have the people who run it not get fired, right? Like have the people who run it not get fired, and then and not have everybody go over to somebody who does get advertisers,
Right.
right? Who because and they're not holding them to account, and who is able to navigate sort of the tricky politics of advertisers' waters where they're saying, well, we don't want to be too much of this or too much of that, right? And where they are saying, oh, if you're having a threat to democracy that's pretty well funded and pretty well viewed, broadly viewed,
Mhm.
can a commercial model be a success, mainstream? Can it be significant? Can it be a plurality of viewers? Can it be Edward R. Murrow, but not necessarily a white guy? If it is, if its approach or mission is to defend or improve democracy and hold capital to account.
I think yes,
Okay.
because I think we have evidence that the opposite is not possible. I'm sure you've seen the news today that the Washington Post has lost something like $77 million in the last year or so. Layoffs are impending, right? And the Post, like other mainstream legacy publications, has been listing ever more rightward in recent years, at least in terms of pandering to right-wing thinking and bigotry in terms of editorial perspectives, right? And op-ed perspectives, right? And I think to some degree in their more traditional coverage overall, I think that there is a bent towards access journalism and both sidesism. And I think that you don't lose $77 million doing your best work, right? I think that there's something behind readers, viewers, consumers, users, whatever you want to call folks, right? Not
Well,
finding that sort of coverage to be what they would like to pick up and see in the newspaper, right?
okay.
But
So
I
Washington,
do
but okay, go ahead. I'm not trying to cut you off.
no, go ahead.
So the Washington Post not being successful might be a data point that you could be
Right.
successful otherwise. It might be. Someone else might say, well, no, there's other reasons for it. Other might say, well, heck, they've got democracy in their damn title. They got in their subject. Maybe maybe the problem with the Washington Post is they've tried to defend democracy, and they've done that at the expense of commerce, and they haven't become a tech company, and so they're going to fail. And this is not a rhetorical question, right? I'm really interested in this, and I have uh, a hypothesis that I am not confident in. Because one possibility is that you can, right, could work. Well, let me not try to answer my question yet. Other examples of who's really doing it right and showing real growth. Any model, just people be, and as a commercial model, that is defending democracy and holding capital to account.
Truly commercial? I mean, so we can't, so not NPR, ProPublica, or the 19th, or like, are you an absolute zero on any
For this question,
nonprofit?
because so that I don't bury, sort of the contraposit, or is it that we need to more focus on alternative models, on additional models, on not just commercial models that can defend or improve democracy and hold capital account. That can be real. That's my definition of real journalism, right? It's not only that we'll use capital to
Mhm,
attack democracy or use
mhm,
capital to attack elected officials, or the only kind of journalism they know how to do is FOIA requests, and the only power they hold to account is elected power or unelected
mhm.
bureaucratic power. That's not all I mean.
Right.
But if they are, so that really is the thing. Is it? No, no. And like what we've got to have is more NPR. We've got to have is more community radio. What we've got to have is more purpose-driven media that has ownership models that are B Corps, or at the most commercial, or that are or they're co-ops, or nonprofits, right? That are also funded by dead rich people money, as well as donations, not just subscriptions. That this is, and I have to say, I my own thought is all only commercial media. I do think that we have a model problem. I think if we're
Mhm.
relying on commercial organizations to save democracy capital to account, I'm wanting very much to find examples that are really working. But you got a broader perspective than I do.
Oh, well, I mean, I think truly the only way that that sort of thing might work is if you have a truly benevolent billionaire backer,
Right.
somebody who is not focused specifically on growth models year over year, right? Somebody who's happy being an owner of something that is merely sustainable rather than growing wildly, right? Somebody who's happy with something that does one thing, news, and not word games and product reviews and everything else, right? Um Recipes and the whole world of what WAPO and the New York Times do right now. Um if somebody was truly interested in just producing a commercial product that was sustainable at a given level year over year, that seems possible to me on a commercial model. But I
Got
think
it.
that, we're in such an era where we're focused on blockbuster growth, venture capital, private equity, right? All of those things are so, the maw is gaping and endless, right? Like there is no way for those sorts of financial models to underpin journalism in a long-term sustainable way that does truly hold power to account and speak truth to power. I mean,
So
that's
Jeff Bezos is a billionaire that owns Washington Post. Do you disqualify him as the benevolent billionaire that you seek?
absolutely. I disqualify anything related to the connecting the word benevolent and Bezos in the same sentence.
All right. Uh, Let me get to, so I do think models are an issue, and what I just heard you say is people should be, you didn't say this, but that's what I heard you say anyway, is that people should be getting where they can their news from purpose-driven sources that aren't dominated primarily by either because they're not private equity owned, or they're not hoping to be private equity owned soon, and that people should be attending to the ownership model as well as to what is they're clicking upon.
Mhm,
The I want to get something else. It's sort of a hard pivot. Forgive the hard pivot. You critique the wash, rinse, repeat of election punditry,
mhm.
and because repeat is in the word, it gives me the excuse to repeat it. Wash, rinse, repeat. What do you mean? What's wash, rinse, repeat journalism?
I mean, laundering the same language, questions, queries over and over again every 2 years through the sort of inevitable horse race cycle of punditry, right? The who's going to win and what do they need to do to win? And those are interesting questions that can be valuable. However, you spend enough time watching this same conversation take place over, in my case, like 20 years, right? you start to notice patterns that start feeling less like patterns and more like automatic programming, right? It's the question of how to appeal to the centrist white moderate has been raised like clockwork every 2 years since I started covering politics in 2005, right? And I feel sure that it wasn't a new idea then, right? Um, and it's frustrating and boring and kind of rote, um, but it's dangerous when we're looking at an election like the one we're facing in November, right? Potential, I mean, like, I'm hyperbolically, but potentially the last election we might have in like a really meaningful, sort of free and fair way, right? So the rinse, repeat of punditry, of political machinating, of horse racing, it's exhausting. I'm tired of it. I wish that there were something else to listen to every 2 years because it is exhausting.
What would a better view, what would a better sounding, what a better perspective, what a better practice look like or sound
Yeah.
like?
I mean, I would just truly love to hear more from, for, and about folks who are impacted by policy and politics, right? I want to hear less about how does Joe Biden game out the next 3 months by appealing to XYZ voters in light of XYZ statements from Trump, right? I'm like, that doesn't tell me anything about what my world might look like if either one of them are elected, right? But I would love to see more coverage that really looks at policy impact, that looks at the real lives of people, that I would love to see coverage that is by, from, and for people who are most affected by politics and policy and the sort of left and right swing, right? Unfortunately, journalism remains a pretty white middle class or upper middle class institution in terms of who is able to break into the industry and maintain a career in the industry over time, right? In a lot of ways, journalism is hostile deliberately so to people of color, to low income folks, to undocumented folks, right? It's not an industry that welcomes people who have true, like, real life lived experience in terms of being affected directly by some of these core key policies. And I would simply just love to see more of that and less of like Nate Silver writing his little numbers around on his little board.
So I hear you saying more real problems, more real impacts. What are real possible solutions? Why maybe those impacts of, by, and for people who are impacted and most impacted by them.
Mhm.
What are Let's dig into that. What are some examples? What are some areas, sort of policy areas and or impact areas, and human areas too, right? I mean, like also like the for whom and of whom and by whom
Mhm.
as well. But what are some of the things that you think media is just really missing, or just getting way wrong, or just not beating the drum well enough or loudly enough?
I think an interesting example of this is the ongoing newsification of what's happening along the Texas-Mexico border, particularly in Eagle Pass, Texas, and environs. We know that Greg Abbott and Texas politicians have implemented some horrible, deadly policies along the border, razor wire in the river, right? Putting more and more cops around the border, right? There were the caravans of Trumpists that were traveling to the border, last year, right? Foaming at the mouth for, a Civil War II redux, right? Um, in all of that coverage, I think was truly genuinely lost a fundamental question, which is, what does it actually look like there? What is life like along the Texas-Mexico border? What is life like for the folks who are crossing the border, who cross the border every day going back and forth, right? It's, the newsification of it all allowed, I think, a general understanding, or created a general understanding, a general delusion that the border is a dangerous place, that it's a site of conflict, that cities along the border are overrun with, you know, boogie persons, right, from the South, right? Um, Look, Eagle Pass is a perfectly normal city. Laredo's a perfectly normal city. McAllen's a perfectly normal city. Brownsville is a totally normal place, right? Gajillions of Texans and snowbirds go to Nuevo Progreso in Mexico every year to get dental care because it's so much cheaper there, right? Um, so it is mind-blowing to me that the coverage of immigration in this country um, is takes as its launch point these terroristic fear tactics that are rooted in, again, like fascist policing, right? And in over policing and in the creation of, these specters of criminals at the border, when it's just simply not the case. Like, I'm not saying there's no problem with immigration policy in this country, right? But the whole conversation has been so dominated by, like, do we need more cops there? What about the razor wire in the river, right? Whereas, I think there's so much more room for stories about who lives there and why, who crosses the border and why, how are these policies affecting them? And you do see coverage of that sort of thing in border newspapers. You see it in outlets like the Texas Observer. You see it in progressive and left-wing outlets. Prism Reports is a great place for stories like that, right? But it feels like the mainstream and legacy papers, including, my local paper here, the Statesman, the Morning News, the Chronicle, take as their basis the political noise first, and then might supplement with a human interest, a human impact, right? I want to see that flipped. I want to see the human impact first. I want to see the human interest first. And then maybe let's talk about what it means for politics.
Who else are you liking up there? Who else do you think that you want to lift up, that people should be following, should be listening to, should be reading, should be sharing?
Oh gosh. I mean, I will forever be a cheerleader for public radio and cooperative radio. And we have, I think our public radio network here in Texas is great. The Texas Standard is very good on a lot of issues. Again, the Texas Observer, love.
And things are going
And
great in Texas. It's
I
all figured
mean,
out.
there's a lot of stories to tell here.
Yeah.
But you've got other stuff like Bolts magazine, and Press On South, which is a great press collective that tells stories from the South. Scalawag, right? There are these places that tell these really interesting stories, but they are so underfunded and underappreciated. And I think there's a real dichotomy in the news world increasingly, or maybe, I don't know, increasingly, I don't suppose I can back that up with data, but the delineation between an activist journalist and a movement journalist and a mainstream and legacy journalist, right? Those two divergent paths, the fact that those paths are divergent is very troubling to me, right? I think Maggie Haberman is a movement journalism for the movement journalist for the mainstream, right? Just as, Tina Vasquez is a movement journalism on immigration, right? And I think we lie to ourselves when we pretend that, the Habermans of the world, the Glenn Threshers of the world, right, are somehow objective, biased, better informed, have better perspectives, right, than than folks who do movement and activist journalism work. And I just all journalism is activism. It just depends on who you're rooting for, really.
Yeah. And there's still so many people. I think we forget. I think we think that post Watergate journalism
Hmm.
is or even immediately pre Watergate journalism
Uh-huh.
is the norm or when things started.
Hmm.
But I don't have to go far to find the Astoria Democrat Herald and so many newspapers with Democrat in the name
Uh-huh.
that they said, no, the purpose of us sharing information is to try to blank. It is not
Right.
merely an act of commerce, it is to blank. And
Hmm.
it turns out that readers respond to things that are about blank, not only the back of our cereal box because we needed something to read as a Gen X kid because we didn't have phones, but something that has a purpose, something has a reason. And we can disguise that reason, or we can say that reason and it's journalism itself. Okay, to what purpose? I would
Right.
like to say to what purpose? Okay, purpose to knowing stuff. Okay, knowing stuff for what purpose? And if and if and if there is if that's it, I still have questions.
Yeah.
And because if you pretend that there isn't just that, if there isn't rather another layer, then your answer is commerce. If it
Right.
really is just for commerce, then okay, I'm on team private equity. That's the answer, right? Not just because that's what it is. If the purpose is commerce, the purpose is commerce.
Right.
If somebody says it's for democracy, then I understand it.
Hmm.
And to be clear, for me as a consumer, if something is news just for commerce, then it's like I need to be something I'm already addicted to. Then it's got to be for sports and like TV shows that I really like, right?
Right.
Or like rating products that I might buy. Like they'll get me for that kind of crap. But if
Uh-huh.
I'm going to go beyond that, then I'm going to care. I want it to be about democracy. I want that newspaper that has as its purpose defending democracy. I think that's what journalism is for. That's what I think. And
Well,
that's why I asked, go ahead.
well, that's what journalism has truly always been for. Real. Well,
It's a good
maybe
question.
not entirely. I mean the if your listeners are interested, the best book on this is called The View from Somewhere by Lewis Raven Wallace.
Hmm.
It's a brilliant history of journalism that gets into, I think the subtitle is something like the myth of objectivity or something, right? Anyway, their book is fantastic. It's a comprehensive history that I think in particular, if I'm recalling correctly, really digs into the roots of journalism as a union project and a labor rights project. A lot of original newspapers and publications and magazines were rooted in labor organizing and that sort of thing, right? So just fundamentally sort of a leftist project, but also like a leftist political goal oriented project, right? Like these aren't publications that were sort of like generally for democracy, right? They had a purpose, right? Which was to organize and disseminate news to a particular population of people who had a shared goal, right? Um,
So even more
and
grand, even more specific. Even it would be like today, you'd also have a labor one, or as if a group of environmentalists got together and we're going to create a news organization
right,
that is going to cover lots of stories, but our goal is to save the planet and save climate, right?
right,
Or feminist organizations as our
right.
goal is to facilitate the rise of the matriarchy, or et cetera, et cetera.
Precisely, right. And so, it really wasn't until this period you were talking about, the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s, where, we sort of have this imagined golden age of objective journalism speaking truth to power. That was a manufactured idea that had a pretty limited shelf life and changed significantly with the rise of cable news, right? So, even once you get into the cable news era, a tremendous shift happens across all industries, not just broadcast, right? So, the idea that there is some great pure objective way of doing journalism is ahistorical, and to me that's very freeing.
Hmm.
I love the idea that objectivity is BS, right? I like that. To me, I'm just like, phew, good, screw that, we don't even have to mess with it anymore, right? And that's when I think you get into really interesting stories and reporting and meaty stuff that really tells stories about people's real lives, right? And I think that that's Rewire News is a great example of this. Covers reproductive health policy across the country and internationally, and has for many years. There's they are biased in favor of facts to the extent that like science and medicine is a true and measurable thing, right? They don't have to both sides news about abortions. It doesn't make them any less accurate. It makes them more accurate, right? Um, I think that stuff is really exciting. And I think the constraint of the myth of objectivity does the whole industry a disservice.
All right. So what should we do? I have at least three options,
Okay.
and then additional options could be combo options, and there could be options that have not occurred to me. I'm sure there are options that have not occurred to me. But here are three. One, we can tell big media to be different. We can criticize the New York Times or urge that they do better trainings or try to train them from the side
Uh-huh.
which is a nice way of putting social media criticism of them. Okay, that's one. Option two, telling viewers and listeners to pay attention to different stuff, including stuff with different ownership models, including stuff that is goal oriented, that is mission driven, that is purpose pursuing.
Mhm.
Option three, working to make alternative news better,
Mhm.
telling, hey, Fox News didn't win. I mean, making an argument here. Fox News didn't win merely because more Americans wanted it. Fox News won for a couple of reasons. One, because they were able to appeal to a more monotheistic, monochromatic, monopolitical market. It was harder for another coalition to do. Said, hey, we're gonna aim at not just urban white people over the age of blank, right? That are almost entirely Christian. Like that's a definable market. And if you're trying to say that shouldn't just rule the country, then you
Mhm.
have a less definable market. Okay. But their other advantage was they paid a lot of attention to what their people looked like, what they sounded like,
Mhm.
what the visuals looked like. They did put a whole lot of like they took production years ahead of where Walter
Mhm.
Cronkite was. And everybody else was behind on sort of just visual, and they would do stuff not hung up by things like, I don't know, some people might call it basic morality, other people call it political correctness.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but they work to make it look like something that their audience would want to watch. Okay. So three things, and you could pick one that you care most about. You could say any of them that you think are dumb and not really worth doing, or you could put percent, utils on any of them. Say, I think it's 40 shares of that, 20 shares of that, and 40 shares of the other one. Or you could say, Jeff, none of these are the most important. Instead, people just need to buy my book.
Well, I don't have a book yet,
All
so
right, all
we don't
right,
have to worry about that one.
all right.
So re-criticism of mainstream and legacy, they don't care. That is a non-viable model. I think we saw this most notably or starkly, was it last year or the year before, when a number of journalists signed an open letter against the New York Times's transphobic bias in their coverage. And I was one of the journalists who signed that letter. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of us, including people active in the newsroom today. And the Times's response was to sanction current employees and act like the rest of us were insane. And that's about as
And by
legitimate.
sanction, you mean punish, as distinct from sanction meaning give permission to?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes. um so that's about as legitimate a criticism as an organized group of journalism folks could do, and the Times simply did not care. In fact, I think it might have pushed the Times even further to sort of
Like, oh,
double.
those aren't our people. They're
Right.
clearly critical. They're clearly our enemies. We're gonna
Right.
play to our friends.
Right. So, I think there's sort of a similar thing happening with NPR recently, right? The white guy with the grievance, I can't even remember his name, who claimed that he quit because NPR was too liberal, right? Now what we're seeing is NPR enacting a massive like editorial overhaul of their entire process that is not meant to create, that is meant, that will probably have the impact of farther right biased coverage.
Wait, hold on
um
though. You just said something really important. You
mm,
said they do care. They just don't seem to care about lefty stuff.
oh well, yes, sorry, yeah, to be clear, yes. If we're talking about criticizing in the service of moving even to the center, let alone left, it's a non-starter. If we're talking about criticism moving them to the right, 100%. Like if
Seem to be
that's
open
what
to
you
it.
want, you got it, right? Um, so right. So I think criticism as a leftward push is a non-starter with mainstream and legacy.
Okay.
Um, it is hard
But
to
but maybe but maybe it's people should not be discouraged from doing it because if
oh
there
no,
is
they should
only one,
for
if
sure
there
do it.
if they're only hearing it from I don't know Jordan Peterson, then that'll
Right.
make their it's the trench warfare will be only one direction.
Precisely. And and vocal criticism and has all manner of benefits beyond achieving one specific stated goal of move X coverage to the left, right? There are all kinds of advantages to be seen offering criticisms and alternative views, right? So wholly worthwhile, of course. To your second point, getting folks to read, watch, consume something different. Uh, I mean, interesting but difficult. Because our attention is so scattered these days, right? I think that there's such a push towards in like niche independent journalism. Like we're seeing this with the rise of newsletters and Substack and that sort of thing of like sort of journalists like me, right? Who basically I'm running a one woman publication for people who like the Andrea Grimes Daily, right? And I, can hope and try to cultivate, a bigger audience all the time, but it's really sort of a finite resource there on that. Um,
You do not contain multitudes,
I, I contain multitudes, but
but you are
they're
not personally multitudes.
not personally multitudinous. Um, and it's figuring out what people actually want and what they will tolerate and what they will go for, and especially what they will pay for, is obviously one of the biggest questions in journalism today. Um, I think that once you get comfortable with where you get your news, it's kind of hard to move away from that. And I speak,
Yeah.
sort of from personal experience, right? Um I have my 5, 6, 7 publications, magazines, shows that I really like, TikTok creators and influencers, right? And you kind of have to twist my arm to get into something new
Yeah.
because there are so many options, right? So I don't, tough, but interesting on that one. Um,
So
and then
the other is to try to and I could make it a fourth or conflate it is uh, helping alternative stuff be better, which I could also or instead say or in addition say starting new stuff, which might include the Andrea Grimes Daily.
I mean, this is really where I think the true win is possible. I think that um cooperative journalism models, reader consumer owned journalism models, um, those sorts of things have a lot of promise. I think nonprofit models are still great. I mean, I know that it's really difficult to run a nonprofit newsroom. I have worked for enough of them and seen what that looks like from the inside. But we have some great examples: ProPublica, the Texas Tribune, the 19th, right? Prism, Rewire, right? Like there are these options as long as there is long-term commitment and investment on both the leadership and the readership level, right? um and funding great journalism is expensive, investigations are expensive, and producing really well reported work is expensive. It takes talent, it takes time, it takes dedication. Um, and but I do think people will pay for it. I think people appreciate it. I think readers appreciate it. I think we've seen that there are models that can make it work. So I think improving the alternative left progressive press, better funding it, is the most viable way forward.
Ownership models. So I heard everything, including, I'm sort of, I think a lot about the ownership model thing. And what is it, a benevolent purpose trust? I forget about it, but there's a new, I forget the
Mm,
name of it, but there's a new sort of, uh, or more newly used, ownership structure
mhm,
that allows for an organization to be a little bit commercial, but
mhm.
but then make sure that it's held to a purpose. So it kind of has a board that
Right.
preserves it. You can imagine a bank, you can even imagine an insurance company. But I
Mhm,
think for those, and I've raised money before, right? And I've raised money from people, of course, who have it. And I've raised money from people who have it, who care about things. That's why they would give it when I wasn't
mhm.
giving them anything back except for gratitude and hopefully mildly less bad democracy. And when uh, and they would own a company. They would sell the company. So, well, what are we going to do to make sure that who we sell it to is going to do what we want? Well,
Mhm.
typically, what that's to quote Don Draper, that's what the money is for. You don't get to decide anymore. They get to decide. So then you take the money and you got to do something with it. I do think, as Steyer has done, as the Steyer family has done
Mhm.
with Beneficial State Bank, as that we should be looking, that we do need to talk to the not quite oligarchs among us and say, if you actually believe what you say and don't want an oligarchy, then don't just leave money to the hospital, don't just leave money to the children's fund, leave money to democracy. And we need real institutional support to make sure that oligarchy doesn't just run everything. Because this is another thing in terms of change. And I haven't read the book that you plugged, but I would almost, without writing it, I would still ask for a second edition or a fourth edition if there have already been three. And that's because one thing that's different now from the muckraking era and the progressive era 120 years ago is
Mhm,
that it used to be that Upton Sinclair would write something about an oligarch who owned factories,
mhm,
who ran trains, who
mhm,
controlled oil. Now, the oligarchs control media, control information, control brains, control the conversation, control the narrative. So, what's
mhm,
Upton Sinclair supposed to do? What's the muckraker supposed to do? What's the
mhm,
progressive Republican, to be clear, journalist 100 years ago
mhm.
supposed to do? Where are they publishing? This is, to me, if we don't say this, and I'm using a little bit of my louder voice because I wanted to start, something I started saying before, because I want to not fall into the same trap. This is the thing I started saying a little while ago. I used to get frustrated. I remember when the journalism was covering kids let's take the insurrection, let's take the Trump election. And I remember, and you've plugged NPR, and I, roughly speaking, in favor of public media for sure. And I am not always in favor of the tone of voice,
Oh, sure. Mhm,
because I was just imagining what happens. What happens if we did have martial law? What
mhm.
happens if we did have just full on? What if January 6th had been successful? And I'm just imagining the NPR journalist saying, democracy was lost today. Some people were in favor of it, some people were opposed. We've interviewed several people who think it's a good thing. The democracy has gone away and the United States is changing its name to the disunited states of not America anymore, or something. And some other people who think it's a problem and they're organizing a protest. Let's hear the important perspectives of the protesters. And I'm
Mhm.
like, at some point, you have to be willing to be a little louder, because at some point it's serious. And this is sort of what you're saying
Yeah.
in the New York Times. At some point, you have to say, this is different. Of course, their response could be, well, not, it could be better than the New York Times and still be a challenging response. But if we yell, we'll be yelling every day because there's so much to yell about now. And this is part of the problem, which is then why I go back to ownership, which is why I go
Mhm,
back to model. I
mhm,
don't have a
mhm.
question. I screwed up the whole darn show. I screwed up the whole darn show. You triggered me, Andrea Grimes.
I mean, here's what though. Again, I reiterate again that, the criticizing NPR or WAPO or New York Times to push them to the left is simply not going to happen. I think you're absolutely right that the day democracy falls, they're going to be out there at the diner in Ohio asking people what they think about it, right? And that'll be, the coverage, right?
That's even better. That's even better. Going to the diner and asking, "Oh, what do you think about the fall of democracy there?" What do
I
you?
mean, they'll do it. They'll do that. Mark my words, it will happen, right? So, but that's not our only option in terms of making sense of an event like the fall of democracy or the slow crumbling demise of democracy as we're seeing now, right? Which is why, we're seeing crackdowns on TikTok, on social media, right? Which is why there's so much opposition to alternative platforms and alternative forms of information sharing, right? It's why politicians want to make us afraid, or those of us on the left, I think specifically, to speak our minds, etc. Right? That's why they want to get rid of critical race theory. It's why they want to ban books about and for queer kids, right? So there is this push, right? This top-down push to silence free thinking and free speech, especially left-leaning speech and ways of thinking, right? But we also have such interesting new ways of communicating as well. And if we can preserve those, I think if we ever come out the other side, we'll live in a very interesting and more equitable and just world. If we get into sort of like fabulous tech futures that have nothing the fuck to do with AI. Oh, I'm sorry. I
It's a
said,
podcast. I think we can say that, but he
sorry.
also has
Okay.
an editing machine. I
um,
think it's
you
okay.
know, interesting tech futures
I
that
think
have
you can say
nothing
whatever
to
the
do
fuck
with
you want.
AI and nonsense, right? But like really talking about communicating with each other in interesting ways and telling our own stories. And that's why I keep going back to the idea of cooperative and reader-owned publications, right? I think offer such interesting perspectives and alternatives to what is inevitably going to be the interview about the fall of Rome at the diner.
What makes you want to yell? So I raised my voice in this conversation. I shouldn't be the only one with the permission to do that. You don't have to yell. It's totally up to you. But what are the things that happen that you're like that don't feel like they deserve the, oh, what do you think? That's interesting. What are things that happen there like you wish had a little bit bigger font or had a little bit bigger volume or a little more flash?
Yeah, well, I mean, abortion is my issue, right? And I cannot ding dang stand the normalization of anti-abortion lobbyists, anti-abortion politics, anti-abortion leaders. I flipping hate the credulous New Yorker profile of Jonathan Mitchell, right? That's like, what makes this guy tick? Right? It's fucking fascism. Fascism makes the motherfucker tick. Like, that's what the guy does. He hates women and he wants to ban abortion, and that's his whole goal in life, right? Um, I just can't take this fascination with right wingers, especially anti abortion folks, as if there's something deeper and more interesting to what they're doing beyond the bare desire to oppress women and trans people. Like, that's it. That's the whole game. It's what they like to do. It's motivated by white Christian heteropatriarchy. They're not particularly brilliant. They're not even particularly evil. It's like they're truly like banal, boring, batshit people, but they continue to be treated in the mainstream and legacy press as if they are credulous people with interesting ideas that should be taken seriously rather than lying liars who love oppression. And it just really grinds my gears.
I appreciate it. If you would like to raise your voice, you of course have the opportunity to do that. And how would one not be, particularly if one has to face those choices, if one has lived experience or adjacent to it,
Mhm.
and how could one only treat this as both sides of the issue? How could one not think that this had base and basic and essential and fundamental humanity involved in it, including what makes
Mhm.
us feel, the things that we care about, and
Mhm.
where we actually live? And I I struggle with it. I struggle with it. I struggle with how many times I should yell or not. right? And I do. I struggle with it strategically. I struggle with it with the next generation that I know of protesters who does things like stop traffic. And
Uh-huh.
and my strategic brain says, no, you want to run a protest so the people watching the protest want you to be in charge. Don't run a protest so the people who are watching the protest want you to just go away forever. Okay. But at the same time, if I were a high school student now, if I were a college student now,
Hmm.
uh, I can't imagine wanting to be polite. And so I'm stuck. I don't want to say I'm stuck. I still manage to get through the day, but I am a more robust version of ambivalent. If ambivalent didn't mean like I think strongly, I things that occasionally conflict. I think them very strongly, and I feel them very strongly. By and here is something I just want to ask you about. How do we make? Okay, so I'll put the question first, and then I'll so it reminds me that there's going to be one. Uh, I'm sorry. How do we help make the important stuff interesting? Now I'll explain. I took, well, it was officially a media training. To say I took a media training would suggest that I am media trained. I am not saying that. I took a media training. It was brief. And in the media training, and it was for a nonprofit organization, they gave a simple formula. So this is how I was taught to find a story. It is a simple formula. X is happening,
Hmm.
and it is interesting because of Y. X
Hmm.
is happening, and it is interesting because of Y. And then the critique of a story would be, all right, X, you found something that's happening, solve for Y. Why is it interesting? And this was very useful. And almost every time they used this formula, it would improve
Hmm.
somebody's like in the little training, in the little class, would improve what they were doing. Oh, this is why it's interesting. They say, why is it interesting? Why is it interesting? Why is it interesting? It was excellent.
Hmm.
It stuck with me though. It stuck with me. It was 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And it stuck with me because now what I have seen happen is a great deal of expertise garnered around making any number of things happening interesting, including things that are not important. In fact, what I would say is they didn't solve for what I call the real why, which is why does it matter?
Yeah.
Why is it important? So I know how to make sports interesting, or at least I see other people who are able to do it. I know how. In fact, legions of news now seems to take the habits and conceit and trappings of journalism to take stuff that isn't important
Hmm.
and make it seem so and make it seem interesting. What I'm interested in, the kind of stuff I think you're interested in, is trying to take the important and make it
Hmm.
interesting. How do we do that? Any tips?
um Gosh, I mean, if I truly knew the answer to that question, I would be on a yacht somewhere enjoying the fruits of my labor, or of somebody else's labor in implementing my ideas.
Oh, geez.
We're all capitalists at heart, aren't we?
There you go.
Gosh, I think that, um, hmm, hmm. How are you defining interesting?
Uh, Makes me want to keep getting it. Makes me want more of it.
Huh?
Connects synapses and makes some chemical reaction inside my brain that I feel
Right.
moves me in
Um,
some way.
um, I mean, I think being really successful at that kind of thing is as much about delivery model and messenger as it is about subject matter, right? Um, and that I think is a particularly difficult balance to strike. When folks get it right, it really works. I think that, gosh, I don't know. I mean, the example that's coming to mind for me in terms of like a truly like recognizable phenomenon of combining meaningful with interesting would be something like the John Oliver show or the Daily Show, right?
Oh
Where
yeah.
you're able to convey really important ideas and sometimes very serious ideas, right, in humorous ways, right? I mean, that I don't actually watch either of those shows with any
Yeah.
regularity, and I never have. But in terms of what I know works, I think that's like a pretty good example,
Mhm.
right? But I think, if we're talking about print, right, then you want something that's satisfying to hold in your hand. You want a book that feels good. You want paper that's nice. I even like the feel of newsprint on my hands, right? Like there's so many factors in messaging that are about so much more than the message. And there are so many things that turn readers, consumers, listeners on or off that has nothing to do with the message. Coming from a background working in communications for reproductive justice organizations and messaging on abortion, the package is often as important as the message itself, right? The place that these conversations happen, the person who's having the conversation, the tenor of the conversation, the length of the conversation, right? um Man, I don't know. I it's
It might have been a fair question. It's on my mind. And you can see, and it's been how are you doing for time, by the way?
I'm fine. Yeah.
All right. Because I've been a little, because we've gotten stuck on where I am stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And where I am stuck is the fundamental question of what are we going to do about the political conversation, and how do we get the political conversation and the public conversation to yield the public interest?
Right.
I'm stuck there, and I will acknowledge my stuckness. So a year ago, you said there was a very clear answer as to whether Biden will secure reelection.
Uh-huh.
Your answer was maybe.
Yep.
And in all that's happened over the past 12 months, from the Republican primary to the New York election interference trial, the various Supreme Court scandals,
Mm-hmm.
taking various boats and turning flags upside down, promises from Project 2025 to gut the federal civil system,
Mm-hmm.
to pursue mass deportation. Is there any more clarity when you read the prognostication tools regarding Joe Biden's chances? And that's to make no mention of gold Donald Trump's sneakers and the Donald Trump Bible.
um are you asking if I think his chances
Still,
have
maybe
improved in a year?
improved or gotten worse.
um I don't think they've changed significantly.
Yeah.
Um, I would love to have a different answer to that.
Yeah.
I think that I mean, oh God. I mean, in the column that you're referencing, is more or less sort of restating the obvious over and over and over again for about 1,100 words, which is that Donald Trump is a criminal and Joe Biden isn't. And so, like, to even talk about policy issues or missteps or mistakes or whether the guy can remember his own ding dang name, right? Like, I don't like, one of them is a criminal insurrectionist and the other one isn't. And that hasn't changed, other than one of them has sort of become more of a criminal over the last year, right? Um, you know, so to the extent that Joe Biden's chances improve, I don't know. Like we're still in the same shitty soup we've been in, right? I think that Biden has not done himself any favors on abortion or on Israel and Palestine. I think that young folks are not loving what they're hearing from the Biden administration on both of those issues. I don't think that that's going to have a massive impact on the election itself in terms of the presidency. It probably could have some impact on down ballot races, especially in really competitive districts, right? Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to know what you think.
I think it's a very clear maybe. I think it's a very clear maybe. I have thought for a long. I thought Donald Trump was going to lose to Hillary Clinton. I'm still.
Well, he did lose to Hillary Clinton. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, and I still trust. Um, I'll put it this way so I don't sound like a conspiracy monger. If someone told me that there were in fact ballot irregularities, or in fact that the weird voting machine stuff that was reported
Mhm.
during that election, if I learned that stuff in fact did manipulate votes
Mhm.
in several states, I would be no more surprised about that
Mhm.
than I was about the announcement of who became the next president.
Yeah.
That's the way I would put it.
Mhm.
So uh, I have what I believe is that Donald Trump cannot be elected president. He can't. He
Right.
is. He is. He. There is not a majority of Americans who will elect him.
Mhm.
I also believe there is not even a 46% plurality of Americans who, if given unvarnished information, would vote for him. Uh,
Right.
my concern is there are so many forces that are from the most oligarch controlled media we've ever seen. And I don't primarily mean legacy media. I don't primarily
Mhm.
mean like newspapers and broadcast news.
Mhm.
It's not what most people do, right? That's not
Mhm.
what most people think. Uh, to third, fourth, and fifth party candidates
Mhm.
who are getting buoyed either with their knowledge or without their knowledge
Mhm.
by the very folks who want to
Mhm.
topple democracy,
Yeah.
to more effective foreign interference on our elections than
Mhm.
I think we've ever seen.
Yeah.
We've had it. There've been various attempts in the past, but it's never been that quite this effective because there haven't been as many unregulated and hard to regulate tools to do that.
Mhm.
Basically,
Mhm.
pre-social media it was harder. You had to rig CBS News or some darn thing. That I am more fearful. I am more convinced that the Republican candidate cannot win, and I'm more fearful about the state of our decision-making processes than I've ever been, and where that irresistible force and that immovable object meet, and what happens when they do.
Yeah.
I got no crystal ball any better than yours.
Yeah.
I I
Yeah.
I I do have a question that might go, okay, this is my segue question. Here's my porch game. Okay,
Okay.
when people come to my porch, and I ask this question very often. I've been asking a little bit less lately, but because I kind of got my answer a while back. Uh, who is the worst president of your lifetime? What I'm going to try to do. I want to rank the worst presidents of your lifetime,
Uh-huh.
and if there's and it is not a game to guess our ages. It has a particular point. But who's if you start ranking the worst presidents of your life, think about it for a moment. Let's see if and you don't have to play my game with me, but I want to invite you to if you're not pressed for
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it would be a real tough contest between Reagan and Trump.
All right.
I think it's hard to overstate the lasting legacy and impact of Reagan. I don't think Trump could. I don't think the threat that Trump poses to democracy, I don't think that America's current state of chaos could be what it is had Reagan
Right.
not laid that
There's,
foundation.
there's, and there's always sort of an argument that the earlier thing is more
Right,
impactful than the later thing because the later thing sort of is beget
right,
often by the earlier thing,
right,
and but maybe also that two terms of Reagan versus one term of Trump is one
right,
thing, but two terms of Trump it might be an easier decision. But let's say okay, those are your
right.
bottom two. Who's
Yeah.
next? Who's next worst?
Um, Goodness. Probably I'm tempted to say W. Bush, but that's kind of only because I don't know an absolute ton about HW's term or legacy. But I would put W next.
Okay,
I think probably then let's go HW and then let's go. Oh, now I'm having trouble remembering. Then let's go Clinton and then Obama, I guess. Am I missing anyone in there?
so Nixon, Nixon maybe
I
before
was
your
not
time.
alive for Nixon.
Okay, you were not alive for Ford. Uh,
Correct.
all right. So then you've got. Were you alive for Carter or are you after Carter?
Nope. I'm after
Okay.
Carter.
All right. So then the only person you said Clinton, then Obama.
Hmm.
Okay, you left one out. Where do you put Biden?
Fuck me. I frequently forget he's president. Um,
This is my game.
yeah. Um, huh. I would put Biden, I guess, between Clinton and Obama, maybe.
So, 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 no, your reaction is this is the game because I asked this.
Oh, funny.
Well, I asked this question. I don't ask who's the best president of your lifetime of your lifetime. I don't ask that.
Right. Of course.
It's a hard question for people to answer, particularly people who are lefties who are like
Uh-huh.
kind of mad at the country.
Right.
I asked
Yeah.
them what the worst president of the country, and it's pretty much generally it's generally Trump. Sometimes there's George W. Bush or Reagan in
Hmm.
that answer because I'm not usually asking Republicans when I ask the question.
Right.
And the occasionally and sometimes very often I'm talking to somebody who's older than you, and they'll put Carter in there somewhere, and they'll kind of wrestle, and then we'll have a definition. Well, what do you mean by good
Mm.
president? Because
Right.
Carter, they basically want to be able to say Carter, they think, is a really good man, but they wish that he would have done more
Right.
things like FDR and LBJ. And the person that is left nearly every time is Biden. And and
Oh, that's funny.
and then when they stroke and then when they're left, he's either number one or number two every time. So what I'm left with is, for a person who is politically progressive, Joe
Hmm.
Biden is the best or second best president they have ever seen.
Uh-huh.
Now, if I ask them that question, they have to say no because they're pissed off about something and he's old and something else. But if you're grading on a curve, okay,
Yeah.
you're grading on a curve. What do you got that's better? And, and so anyway, I'm glad we played the game, and thank you so much for
Oh,
playing it.
that's funny.
And it does lead to a question.
Hmm.
Why do we think, and I have my own thoughts about this, but I'm interested in
Hmm.
yours. Why do we think that it is so very, very hard to find almost anybody to say almost anything positive about Joe Biden? And I am taking off the table because he's he's the worst president of our lifetime, because we already know that ain't true,
Right.
or that he's in
Uh-huh.
the middle because we know that's not true either.
Hmm.
And I'm going to take off the table because he's accomplished nothing, because he accomplished a bunch.
Hmm.
I'm also going to take off the table because he's a nasty, evil man who is a perpetual criminal, because that's not him. That's the other guy.
Right.
I'll leave on the table, but mention he's old. Okay.
Sure.
He's an old white guy, and people are tired. A lot of people on the left are tired of them, and not only, and more than tired of them, have deep, legitimate,
Right.
like legitimately reinforced generational anger,
Right.
okay, at them. And I'll very much leave that on the table. But why do you
Uh-huh.
think it's hard for Joe Biden to get sort of a "Let's go Joe" movement?
Um, I'm okay, so I'm thinking back to when Biden was first like genuinely on my radar running with Obama. And I was a young, starry-eyed liberal at that point. I wouldn't have called myself a progressive. Biden seemed like a cool grandpa. I was like, that guy seems like a nice, cool grand. He's got the shades, right? He's sort of like giving this like cool grandpa vibe. Um, and I it is so difficult for me to get back in that mindset of remembering feeling that way about him now. Um, because he I mean, look, he seems like an intelligent and capable person. Obviously, we're talking about him being on the better side of presidents in my lifetime, right? Um, but he's the stuff he the stuff that I think he sucks on, the issues I think he sucks on, I feel very passionate about. I think he sucks on abortion. I think he's been bad on Israel and Palestine.
By sucks on
I
abortion, it sucks on abortion because he won't topple because he won't advocate to get rid of the filibuster, or what's the like? Where does it manifest?
Because he's afraid of the issue overall,
Yeah.
and I think it's fairly clear that he is personally anti-abortion and has
Hmm.
trouble not making that clear in the way he talks about abortion as an issue writ large, right? Um, so I think that there's a lot more he could have done since the fall of Dobbs and even in the run up, right, to protect, enhance, and expand abortion access. Even on a pure messaging level, I think the man could do a ton more. Anyway, so because reproductive freedom is so integral to the the experience of being human and the experience of having freedom to do anything else, for me personally, I his other achievements, while laudable, successful, whatever, right? Um, it makes me hard to like, I just don't really like the guy. I
Yeah.
don't find him charming and affable anymore. I don't consider him like the fun grandpa. I feel I actually like I sort of feel this is like a wild parasocial thing to say, but like I feel like sort of some hostility from him.
Hmm.
Like I feel sort of like this guy wouldn't like me. This guy wouldn't want to
Interesting.
hang out with me. This guy wouldn't find me a charming granddaughter, right? I think
He
this
doesn't feel like he's
guy,
on your side.
and he doesn't feel like he's on my side. It doesn't even feel like he can pretend to be on my side, right? And I think that is probably at the heart of why I don't feel
Yeah.
personal enthusiasm for the guy. I mean, I also though don't really feel that any politician is on my side. I wasn't a massive Obama like stan or
Sure.
fan, right? I
Sure.
don't go in for politicians writ large. It's like even folks like Wendy Davis here in Texas, who's an icon. I have tremendous respect for her, but I'm, not just gonna get the cheerleader out constantly, right? I think that idolizing politicians is the most foolish of fools errands. But there is something specific about Biden, and unusually so, I think, for a Democrat or someone ostensibly politically left, that does feel kind of like he's just not for or about me or my people or my
Yeah.
issues.
So, and I think about this, and I do not have the answer, and nor would I quibble with. I mean, your answer is your
Mhm.
answer, so I wouldn't even attempt to edit it anyway. Answers have occurred to me for writ large, right?
Mhm.
That lie alongside answers that might be better than what I'm going to say, and
Uh-huh.
more important, because I think very often things have multiple reasons, right? Because
Right.
and because my question isn't only about you or isn't only about me. It's why generally, right? Like
Mhm.
why does it seem
Right.
uh where are the like good stuff good stuff Biden has done? You can Google it and you will find stuff, but
Uh-huh.
it's not like a whole lot of Reddit threads. It's not what I see on Twitter, which doesn't exist anymore. It's not what I hear from lefty commentators, right? It's not like it's like
Mhm.
and by the way, when I go back, when I go back, when I ask my dad this question,
Uh-huh.
I think he puts and my dad's old. My dad just turned 89.
Okay.
I think he puts Biden in his top three.
Yeah.
And to be clear, if I said who are the top three presidents, he wouldn't have done it. He wouldn't have
Right.
said I do it from worst, right? And he has a long ass list. That's forgive me for asking Carter. To me, Carter's like young. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I don't even know. I was thinking Nixon. I like, but literally the last person to ask this question was my dad, and Nixon was like modern. And I have asked that question not just your lifetime. I have asked this question of the last 50
Right.
years. That's very often I don't just do lifetime. I do last 50 years.
Yum.
Uh, and but there are a few other things I think he's got against him in
Mhm.
addition to those things. I think the personal relatability thing
Mhm.
is harder for the Democratic voter, for the modern
Mm.
Democratic voter.
Yum.
The majority of them are not white males, and definitely the majority of them are not white males over the age of 60 or 65 or
Right.
70 or 75. So I
Yeah.
think just natural relatability, I do think that's a thing.
Mhm.
Uh, the I do think there's something about the narrative, something about I have hypothesized, right? The
Hmm.
right wing media wants to topple him, wants people not to like him. I think this happened to Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary
Yeah.
Clinton, before she was a candidate for president, was popular. People forget this. She was
Right.
popular. She had cool sunglasses on and
Yeah.
she was popular,
Uh-huh.
right? And then they got their misogynistic, like brilliantly sharp talons out, and
Right.
eventually she was scarred up to heck, and not only in the minds of right wingers, but in the minds of people that just the conversation leaks towards them.
Right.
Second, the foreign oligarchic and anti-democratic powers want to topple him and the Western Alliance and the Democratic small d Democratic Project. The oligarchic media wants to topple him and definitely does not want to give any credit for the roughly speaking progressive or big D democratic stuff that he has done. That's the stuff that
Right.
they hate. They'll put up with some other stuff, but they hate that stuff. Don't want to. And then the left, not to cheapen this view, to be clear,
Hmm.
has a problem with power. It's kind
Yeah.
of part of the project.
Yeah.
They're not. It's you don't want to be motivated politicians. Your goal is not to have a totalitarian leader, right? You're not
Right.
sure you'd want a 4-term president, FDR redux,
Of
right?
course.
Like it's. So I think so. I call it sort of the pincer problem. You know that he's got a kind of problem from the right and the left, but I think it's more complicated than a pincer. There's also sort of
Uh-huh.
other angular weird things coming from the side that are controlling things, and there
Hmm.
isn't a kind of I don't know if I would call it mainstream. I want to find another word, but big-ish media that is like kind of pro-Biden voice. Who's the pro-Biden voice? But it ends up being like clowns like me, middle-aged white guys who are like, he ain't so bad. In fact, when I really look at it on a curve, that guy's pretty good.
I wonder. Okay. May okay, I don't 100% believe this. I'm not sure I even like 20% believe it, but I'm gonna say it.
Sure.
I think that Biden's overall effectiveness as a politician and a president may in fact work against him
Mm,
re this question because uh effective people who are not overachieving often are kind of invisible, right? There's a talent to being the best performing middle manager, right? And that's the person that the corporate executives keep in middle management their whole careers because they keep the business running, they keep profits going, whatever, right? And I think I sort of see Biden in a similar light to that. His successes are not stellar, and his failures, I mean, are not especially spectacular, although I would say he's ooching towards spectacular failure on Palestine, but TBD, I think there's room for correction there. So I think like the fact that he's just sort of like competent makes him pretty forgettable
so
because there's not
yeah.
a lot that's otherwise interesting about him.
I know that's insightful potential. I find it insightful. The and something that occurred to me years ago was, and I'd served both as worked toiled both as an activist and inside an elected chamber, and what I noticed was that effectiveness as an activist was closely linked to one's ability to elevate the temperature in the room,
Mhm.
and effectiveness as an elected leader was closely linked to one's ability to lower the temperature in the room. In fact, the easiest bill to pass is the one that's called a technical fix. Oh, it's a technical fix, right?
Uh-huh.
And then just sails through and nobody worries about it. If you say this is really important,
Yeah.
it's really important, then people are
Right.
like, I can't do that. It's something, somebody said real important. I might need to find the reasons I need to stop it. And it's easier to stop something than it is to make something happen. So what you just said is that resonates. That really resonates. We've been at it for a while, and I really appreciate your
Oh
time.
gosh. Yeah.
What did I miss? What did I not ask you? No, I really appreciate your time. What did I miss? What should have I asked you that I failed to? And or is there anything you want to plug? Yeah. Any last
Uh
thoughts on Texas? We don't have to cover any conversation you now find boring, but anything you want to talk about on Texas?
um No, I mean, I the thing that I will say about Texas, while I have a captive blue state audience in front of me, is that we are trying really the fuck hard down here. Genuinely, like we're trying to unfuck things. Like there's some really badass activism happening here in Texas. And it's just a real bummer to hear from blue state and coastal liberal folks, oh, Texas should just succeed, fuck that place, cut them loose, that sort of thing. Like, we no, like, it sucks to be here, but we're working on it, right? Like, we're doing the best we can. And there's so much cool activism happening here. There's some really great political ideas at the local county city levels that we're trying, right? And yeah, like that shit is getting beaten back by our horrible governor and attorney general. But again, we're trying, right? So my plea to those, sort of watching from afar is to try to appreciate that, like, genuinely there are a lot of people here who are trying to lift up each other and to improve this state, and don't write us off.
Thank you very much for that. Because I want you to mess with Texas. And I want your friends to mess with Texas. And it does win Texas, win America. Like I think
Yeah.
it's not secede Texas, that ain't happening. But win Texas, win America. And even as you were talking, I was just thinking about all the opportunity because it can be a grassroots state. It isn't just one media market, right? And not all of it is as expensive. Not all of it is as expensive as California. So it's all right. So mess with Texas.
Mess with Texas.
Andrea Grimes, thank you so much. We will try to honor your state in a pro-democracy constructive way. And we'll also honor your time by not stealing any more of it. And thank you, Andrea Grimes, for being a democracy nerd.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Cheers.